Welcome to Coffee with Joe for January 25th,
Hey,
2010. It's a Monday. Good morning, Joe.
salute, Pete.
How's that storm treating you down there?
Oh, well, with the power's back on, so at least we can do this now, But
Hopefully it
for
stays on and we can get this recorded.
yes,
Joe, I wanted to talk about a concept that I first heard of when you were talking about your dad, who was a monetary reformer back in the 1970s, a small businessman on Long Island and a
yeah,
monetary reformer based on his experience with banks and their
yeah,
disinclination to lend to him in certain circumstances. But
right,
the concept that you use is that comes from your dad is this concept of the priority use of the money supply. I believe your
yeah.
dad coined that phrase. What
Oh,
did you?
yeah. Well, my dad, he was a businessman. He was employing about 200 people, and he needed to get a bridge loan so that he could basically reorganize his business. And when he went to the bank and told them he needed to borrow $1 million, and that was a lot of money in those days. They wouldn't lend it to him. They said they didn't want to lend it to him, even though he had been borrowing from them for 20 years. And he come to find out by people in the bank that they were preparing for the influx of population, so they wanted to have money put aside for land speculation, real estate, I should say, speculation and development. And my dad, was like, "Hey, I'm employing all these people. They all have mortgages with your bank. They all have automobile loans with your bank and stuff." And they said, "Well, Joe, my dad was Joe also. They said, we have collateral for all those loans, so we're not worried about these guys being able to pay those loans back. So you can see what happens right there. My dad is aghast that the priority use of the money supply for the bankers is to return on investment to the shareholders, not to be caring about creating jobs. And that's why my dad got into looking at how the money system is working, how banking is working, how whether or not people have jobs should matter to the banks or not. And that's how he became a monetary reformist. And he got into that whole concept about priority use of the money supply. That's the important thing, is that we use the money supply to keep the economy working. I can't swear that he coined it, Pete. He first certainly I've ever heard of it. When he threw it at me, you got to realize I was totally against my dad's monetary reforms for a long time, Pete. He used to say, Joey, through the proper and priority use of the money supply, we can solve so many of the problems that we have in the world today. Okay. Um, so let's talk about. I mean, the priority use of the money supply. It sort of comes out, Pete. One aspect of it comes out just when you and I would be talking about the government creating money debt free at issue, and doing it through the budgeting process. Okay, if the government creates, you use the $12 trillion, Pete, as our national economy, 2% growth, $240 billion next year. We're going to do. If the government uses the budgeting process in order to introduce that money into existence, that budgeting process is setting the priority for the use of that money. That's basically what it is. It's no more nor less than that. So that means that however they're going to do it, and my dad had his recommendations, Pete, for how to do it. Okay, however they're going to do it, what's going to happen is that very similarly to all the rest of the budgeting process, Pete, what the government does, okay, they're going to include that 240 billion, I think it was that you said, okay? They're going to include that 240 billion. They're going to target it. They're going to target it to, how, my dad's always said, felt like the best way to allocate it was through congressional districts, because congressional districts, represent all the people in the country. They represent people. A congressional district, because it's population based, basically says it's population based, so the money should be spent. But doesn't mean that it all has to be spent that way. But it's just an example of a way to get that money out into the economy, um, and doing the things that are identified in the budget. Okay, so I'm just saying that the states would be like Vermont, for instance, one congressional district. So Vermont's no different from the state or a congressional district. So Vermont is going to get, its share of that $240 billion, Pete, based on its population. I don't know what that percentage. I should know it. But the point is that money would be spent in Vermont by the people of Vermont according to the priorities established by the people in Vermont. That's what would be in the budget, Pete. Okay. Now,
Joe, just in terms of Vermont, I'm just running those figures real quick in my head. $240 billion. We got just under 500 congressional districts. So that would be $500 million per congressional district, roughly. So that would be $500 million to the state of Vermont. And right now, we're looking at $150 million budget shortfall in the state of Vermont. That would be $500 million debt-free that the state of Vermont would get. So instead of cutting back on our programs right now, we'd have extra money for programs right now. Sorry to derail you on that one.
No, that's no problem, because but one thing to keep in mind, like he always said, it doesn't have to all be that way. That would be part of what's worked out when we revise the monetary system. Okay. In other words, is all of that going to go directly to the states, for their priorities? Is it going to be, half of it going to be by the federal government and half of it by the states? All of that has to be worked out. The important thing is, it's the government's role to determine what that priority use is in a very public process, Pete, right out in front of everybody. This is what we're going to be doing with the money supply. Now,
and because that money's created debt-free, Joe, that means that would fund government activities for the public good, hopefully, without increasing the tax burden on the people, right?
On anybody. Exactly right, Pete.
So, Joe, who's getting the priority use of the money supply now, and how's that working?
Well, first of all, we have the major fact, which is that the investment and shadow banking community is creating, Pete, more than half of the money supply over the last 15 years. Think about that, Pete. Over the last 15 years, the shadow and investment bankers have been creating, more than half the money. What have they been doing with it? You think they've been, funding any bridges or any schools, or you think they've been paying anything for health or education? They've been creating, financial instruments on which they can make more money. So whereas the priority use of the money supply ought to be aimed at the people who own the money system, instead we have a totally fractured, asinine of design monetary system where the money goes always to the rich and make to the richer. Okay, so that's where. Now, as far as the rest of the priority use of the money supply is going, really, Pete, to tell you the truth, a lot of it is going to pay the interest on the money that's already out there. Honest, Pete, that's where a lot of it is going, to pay the interest on the money that's already out there. So we have a totally flawed and fractured system. It's paralyzing us. Okay, I would say that it's the biggest problem that we have in front of us. It's not something that even Volcker is even willing to address. Out of all the guys that are up there, although he's the best, because to me he's the one that I believe has integrity. So that's what's going on now, and we need to get back to something like what my dad was proposing back then.
And the way to do that, to remind people, is to pass some kind of a monetary reform act like the American Monetary Act, which you can find at the American Monetary Institute's website. We've linked to it many times before. Joe, right. I'm going to be away for a couple of weeks. This is our posting for this week. I believe you're going to be posting on your own next week.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
And if listeners have any questions in specific they'd like Joe to address, this would be a good time to get them in. Email them to info@economicstability.org. How's that, Joe?
That sounds good, Pete. That sounds good. Yep.
Okay.